Did you know that hackers can use a basic web page to take control of your systems? Well, they can. And the way that they do that is through something called a web shell. And on today's weekly security nerd out, we're going to talk about web shells. How do they get there and how do they work and how do they ultimately allow the attacker to do what they want with that system? So let's set the stage here. We've got the Teach Me Cyber servers here. They're running a web service that allows it to host web pages. Now, the whole point of this is that the attackers have to be able to place their own web page onto those servers. Can happen a variety of different ways. One common way that we see is that attackers will find some sort of exploit against the web service itself, run that exploit, and then get code execution or at least the ability to place a file on that system. Other ways, the attackers could have access to the web service itself or the web server itself and just manually drop that web shell on there itself. So for this scenario, we're going to assume that there's some sort of exploit that the attacker can run. And so we have our good old hacker here. They're going to run that exploit, and that's ultimately going to allow them to drop a web shell, which is just a malicious web page, onto those servers. Now, when we look at the contents of a web shell, it's fairly basic. Now, they can get really sophisticated in the sense that a lot of different features and everything like that, but what you're seeing here is code that just allows the attacker to execute remote commands on that system. As if they were sitting at that server itself, they can just log into the web page, go run this command, and get the output. And that command is going to run on that web server itself. So some pretty nasty stuff with some very basic code. So just because there's a web shell on there doesn't mean the system is in this perilous state. And we've got Dave here, right? Dave wants to go to the Teach Me Cyber websites, and he can still do that. Now, we know Dave loves pictures of puppies. And so he's going to go to the Teach Me Cyber website, and he's going to be able to get that back. He's none the wiser that there's a web shell sitting on that system because it's not going to interfere with Dave's ability to interact with that website. However, for the hacker, because that hacker knows the specific URL for that web shell, they can go directly to that. And so the attacker is basically just going to type on his keyboard, teachmecyber.com/cmdasp.aspx, and that is going to return back to them a very basic web page that just has what you see below here. It's got the ability for a command and a very poorly spelled execute button. So the attacker is going to go in and they're going to run their command. That's going to get sent over to that web shell. That web shell in turn is going to interpret the command that the attacker sent, run that on the local system, which is the web server, and then return whatever was executed back to the hacker. So in this particular case, the attacker ran the netstat command. That's going to just show a listing of open network connections that are on that system, and the attacker is able to get that output. So that's a very basic example of the types of commands that an attacker can use, but you can see where it goes from there. Because the attacker has full command line access to that web server, they can potentially add users. They can delete files. They can execute commands to be able to download more files as well. And they can also just do whatever they want because they have this capability. The only caveat here is that the attacker is only going to be able to run commands based on what permissions the web service is running at. So if you have if you have a situation where this web server is running with full admin privileges, then the attacker has full access to that system. They're running the commands as an admin. If it's using a less privileged account where it doesn't have full admin access to the system, it's only going to be able to execute commands as the context of that less privileged user account. So the general takeaway here is that while web shells will provide the attacker the ability to interact with the system and execute commands, if it's configured properly, it being the web server, then you can minimize some of that damage. But the bottom line here is it's very, very basic code that the attacker is putting into a simple web page, dropping that on a web server, and then able to go and interact with that remotely, effectively giving them the ability to control that system. And that's it. That's what a web shell is. So pretty basic concept, but very, very powerful. And it's harder for some for some defenders to be able to identify these things because you proactively have to go out and try to look for these things. Not something a lot of companies do. Definitely something companies should incorporate into their overall threat hunting programs. All right, that's it for the weekly security nerd out this week. If you like what you saw, you learned something new, like it, drop a comment. What other topics are interesting for you? What do you want to dig into? And as always, subscribe because it helps us grow this channel and get more information out to more people. All right, we'll see you next week.